Her billionaire husband stole the algorithm she invented, sent her to prison for theft, then paid guards to make sure she lost their baby. For years later, she walked free. That was the day his empire began to crumble. That was the day he realized he should have made sure she didn't survive. Before we dive in, take a moment to subscribe and hit like. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from in Canada, the United States, Australia, Africa, the UK. I'd love to know this story is reaching you. Now, let's begin. Louise Myers heard the word guilty and felt her hands go numb. The courtroom tilted, the mahogany panels of the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan blurring into streaks of brown against fluorescent white. Judge Kaplan's voice continued, mechanical and distant, something about the severity of corporate espionage and breach of fiduciary duty to shareholders. For years. The number landed like a physical blow. 1,460 days. Louise tried to calculate it, her analytical mind grasping for something concrete while everything else dissolved into chaos. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, 7 months pregnant, impossible to hide beneath the navy Armani dress. The one Andrew had bought her for their anniversary, telling the personal shopper, "My wife deserves the best. Make her look like the genius she is." She'd worn it today because some naive part of her believed it would matter what she looked like when they declared her innocent. She'd even straightened her natural hair into the sleek ponytail Andrew once said made her look powerful and professional, wanting to appear credible and composed for the verdict she'd been certain would vindicate her. What a fool! Behind her, someone made a sound, half gasp, half sob. Her mother probably, or maybe her college roommate Jessica. The noise cut through the courtroom's murmur like shattering glass. But Louise couldn't turn around, couldn't move. She could only stand there, one hand pressed against her daughter growing inside her, the other gripping the defense table until her knuckles disappeared into the wood grain, until she couldn't feel her fingers anymore, couldn't feel anything except the weight of Andrew's testimony still poisoning the air. "Your Honor, this is incredibly painful for me." Louise was brilliant, is brilliant. I fell in love with her mind first, her innovations. But after I told her I'd fallen for Victoria, after I asked for a divorce, she changed. She became obsessed with punishing me. The algorithm she claims to have created? She had access to my files, my research, my development notes. When I discovered she'd copied proprietary code to sell to our competitors, I had no choice but to involve authorities. It breaks my heart. She's carrying my child. Every word a fabrication. Every sentence a blade designed to cut her out of her own creation. She'd sat there listening to him erase her with fiction, her water glass trembling in her hand as he described a woman she'd never been. She hadn't stolen his files, she'd created them, every line of code, every algorithmic innovation that made Lemley Capital's trading platform the most sophisticated in the industry. She hadn't copied anything. She'd tried to retrieve her own work after discovering he was planning to patent it solely in his name. She'd never been obsessed. When she discovered his affair with Victoria Ashford, the company's new COO, Louise had confronted him privately in their Tribeca penthouse. And when he'd promised it was over, that Victoria meant nothing, she'd believed him. For the baby she was carrying. For the partnership they built together. Bitter. Vindictive. Thief. The accusations were so grotesque they would have been laughable if they weren't destroying her life. If they weren't sending her to federal prison while 7 months pregnant with his daughter. Liar, she thought with each remembered word. Liar. The marshal touched her shoulder now, surprisingly gentle for someone about to take her freedom. We need to proceed. Louise turned, her body moving without her mind's permission, and looked across the courtroom to where Andrew sat in the front row of the gallery. Victoria Ashford sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee in a gesture of supportive solidarity, her expression carefully arranged into sympathy. The woman who'd helped him steal Louise's work now playing the role of the concerned new partner, standing by a man forced to prosecute his unstable ex-wife. Andrew was crying. Tears streaming down his face, the one Louise used to trace with her fingers on Sunday mornings. His shoulders trembling beneath his custom suit. His hand covering his mouth like he was holding back anguish. His eyes met hers for one terrible, crystallizing moment. And in them, Louise saw no remorse. No horror at what he'd done to his pregnant wife. No guilt about the lies he'd told under oath. She saw only cold satisfaction. The look of a man who'd just eliminated a problem. The look of a man who'd calculated every move and won. Andrew held her gaze for 3 seconds that felt like hours. Then his mouth moved, forming 2 words she could read perfectly across the courtroom's silence. "You're erased." That was the moment Louise Myers made her decision. Not a conscious choice, but something deeper, a transformation happening at a cellular level as the marshals moved to cuff her wrists. She would survive this. And Andrew Lemley would learn exactly what happened when you try to erase a woman who remembered everything. The courtroom smelled like old wood and expensive cologne. Louise Myers stood before the federal judge, her hands folded protectively over the swell of her belly, feeling hope kick against her ribs as if the baby knew something terrible was coming. The navy Armani suit she'd worn to her wedding 6 years ago, back when Andrew had whispered that she was his genius, his secret weapon, his everything, hung differently now, tailored around 7 months of life growing inside her. "Miss Myers," Judge Patricia Hendricks said, her voice carrying the weight of finality, "you have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, and attempted wire fraud." Across the aisle, Andrew Lemley sat perfectly still in Tom Ford perfection, his salt and pepper hair styled just so, his hand resting possessively on Victoria Ashford's knee. The girl, and she was a girl, 26 to his 52, smiled at something on her phone. Blonde. Leggy. Utterly unconcerned that the woman whose life was ending 10 feet away had built the empire that bought her Hermes handbags. The prosecution had been surgical. Louise wasn't a wife. She wasn't the architect of the revolutionary algorithm that had made Lemley Capital the most profitable hedge fund in North America. She was a disgruntled former employee, an analyst who'd helped with administrative tasks and then grown dangerously obsessed when Andrew had ended their brief, regrettable affair. The defendant showed a pattern of escalating delusion. The prosecutor had said, a young man named Davidson who'd never made eye contact with Louise once. When Mr. Lemley refused to leave his longtime partner for her, Ms. Myers fabricated a marriage certificate, claimed authorship of his proprietary work, and attempted to sell his algorithms to foreign competitors. Louise had watched the jury's faces during that summation. Watched the disgust settle in. Another woman scorned. Another false accusation. Another attempt to destroy a good man's reputation. When Andrew took the stand, he'd been perfect. Sympathetic. Pained. Yes, they'd had a brief relationship. Yes, he felt terrible about it. He'd been vulnerable after his mother's death, and Louise had been there, intelligent and supportive. But when she became pregnant and demanded he divorce Victoria, he'd had to end it. "I tried to be kind," he'd said, his voice breaking just enough. "I offered to support the child financially. But Louise wanted everything. My company. My reputation. My life's work. And the algorithm in question." Davidson had prompted gently. "I developed the core framework in 2015, based on 15 years of market research. Louise helped with some data entry, some testing protocols. But the creative work, the innovation, that was mine." He'd looked directly at the jury then, earnest and wounded. I trusted her with access to my files. I never imagined she'd try to steal them. The defense had produced witnesses, colleagues who remembered Louise as Andrew's assistant, a forensic accountant who'd found suspicious communications with a Chinese investment firm, computer logs showing Louise accessing files she had no authorization to view. The marriage license Louise's lawyer tried to submit? The city clerk's office had no record of it. Lost in a computer migration, they said. These things happen. Now, as Judge Hendricks read the sentence, 4 years at FCI Danbury, followed by 3 years supervised release, Louise felt the courtroom tilt. For years. Hope would be 4 years old when Louise got out. If she even got to keep her. The marshals approached with handcuffs. Behind her, she heard her mother sobbing quietly, the same woman who'd called her a liar when Louise had insisted she was married, that she'd created the algorithm, that Andrew was trying to erase her. You always wanted to be more than you were, her mother had said. The shame in her voice had been worse than any verdict. As they cuffed her wrists, Louise looked across the courtroom one final time. Andrew was watching her now, his expression carefully neutral. But as their eyes met, his lips moved, forming 2 words she would never forget. You're erased. Victoria leaned into him, whispering something. Andrew smiled and kissed her temple. The cameras loved it, the faithful billionaire, standing by his partner despite the betrayal of a disturbed employee. Louise felt hope kick again, strong and insistent. Not erased yet, she thought. Not yet. But as the marshals led her toward the side door, she understood with perfect, terrible clarity that Andrew Lemley had just tried to delete her from existence. And somehow, impossibly, he'd made the whole world believe she'd never been real at all. The intake process at FCI Danbury took 6 hours. 6 hours of standing in lines, surrendering her wedding ring, the one piece of evidence Andrew's lawyers hadn't managed to make disappear, being photographed, fingerprinted, and stripped of every last shred of dignity she'd carried through the prison gates. Louise Myers, federal inmate #7382-177, was now property of the Bureau of Prisons. The guard processing her paperwork was a thick-necked man whose nameplate read Morrison. He'd been scrolling through something on his computer, bored, until he pulled up her file. Then his expression changed. A slow smile spread across his face as he looked up at her, his eyes traveling deliberately to her swollen belly. Well, well, he said, leaning back in his chair. You're the one who crossed Andrew Lemley. He let the words hang in the air. Brave. Stupid. Louise said nothing. She'd learned in court that speaking only gave them ammunition. Morrison's smile widened. Mr. Lemley's got a lot of friends. Even in here. He stamped something on her file, hard enough to make her flinch. Segregated housing. For your protection, you understand. Can't have anything happening to you or that baby. The word protection sounded like a threat. Segregated housing meant a concrete cell 8 feet by 10 feet. A metal toilet. A thin mattress on a concrete slab. A single window too high and too small to see anything but a rectangle of grey Connecticut sky. 23 hours a day in this box, with 1 hour for recreation in a slightly larger cage with nothing in it but February cold and the sound of other women screaming. Her family had stopped taking her calls 2 weeks after the conviction. Her mother's last words had been, "How could you embarrass us like this?" Her father hadn't spoken at all, just hung up when he heard her voice. Her younger sister Jasmine had texted once, "I can't believe you lied about being married. About everything. Don't contact me again." Andrew had erased her so completely that even her own blood believed she'd never been his wife. The court-appointed lawyer, a exhausted-looking man named Friedman who'd seemed overworked and underpaid, had stopped returning her calls the day after sentencing. She'd left 17 messages. He never called back. The legal system had processed her, convicted her, and moved on. She was someone else's problem now. In the suffocating silence of segregated housing, with hope doing somersaults against her ribs and no one to talk to but herself, Louise made a decision. If they were going to bury her alive in this concrete tomb, she would use the time to build her resurrection. She requested a Bible. They couldn't deny her that. When it arrived, she began to write. On the tissue-thin pages, in the margins, in microscopic handwriting between verses, Louise documented everything. Every conversation with Andrew about the algorithm's development. The night in 2017 when she'd cracked the pattern recognition framework that made real-time market predictions possible. The weekend she'd spent coding the neural network while Andrew was in the Hamptons with Victoria. Even then, before Louise knew about the affair, she'd been building his empire while he played. She wrote down names. David Chen, the engineer who'd seen her working on the code at 3 in the morning. Priya Kapoor, Andrew's former CFO, who'd been copied on emails. Where Louise explained technical details Andrew couldn't possibly have understood. Marcus Webb from the blockchain conference in 2017 where she'd presented early findings, under Andrew's name, at his insistence, but Webb had known the truth. Every witness to her marriage. The officiant, Judge Catherine Reynolds, who'd performed the ceremony in her chambers. Their neighbors in the Tribeca loft who'd received Christmas cards addressed at Andrew and Louise Lemley. The doorman who'd called her Mrs. Lemley for 6 years. She wrote about the affair. The night she'd found Victoria's earring in their bed. The credit card statements showing hotel rooms Andrew claimed were for client meetings. The text messages she'd screenshot before he'd made her delete them. Can't wait to start our real life together once I deal with the L situation. Hope kicked hard, as if approving of her mother's work. Louise hid the pages inside the Bible's binding, carefully working them between the cardboard backing and the leather cover. If Morrison or anyone else flipped through it, they'd see only the Word of God. They wouldn't see the testimony she was building, verse by verse, page by page. At night, lying on the concrete slab with her hands on her belly, Louise whispered to her daughter, "I'm going to get us out of here. I'm going to make them see the truth. I promise you, Hope. He won't erase us." But in the darkness, with Morrison's footsteps echoing in the corridor and the February cold seeping through the walls, Louise couldn't shake the feeling that Andrew Lemley had friends everywhere. And that her protection was the most dangerous thing in this place. The pain started at 3 in the morning, a tearing sensation that woke Louise from dreams of algorithmic patterns and Hope's imagined face. At first she thought it was just Braxton Hicks, the practice contractions the prison nurse had warned her about. But then she felt the wetness, warm and wrong, spreading beneath her on the thin mattress. "Help!" Her voice echoed off concrete walls. "Someone help me. The baby." She pressed the emergency call button. Once. Twice. 10 times. The red light blinked uselessly in the darkness. "Help! I'm bleeding!" Louise screamed until her throat was raw, until she tasted copper, until the contractions were coming so fast she couldn't breathe between them. Through the tiny window in her cell door, she could see the hallway. Empty. The night shift guard station was 40 feet away. Someone had to hear her. 30 minutes later, she knew because she watched the clock, memorized every second, burned them into her mind. Morrison finally appeared at her door. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. As if he couldn't hear her screaming. "Please," Louise gasped. "My baby. Something's wrong." Morrison looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he keyed his radio. Medical emergency in Seg unit. Inmates in labor. Send a gurney. He paused. No rush. She's been dramatic all night. By the time they wheeled her to the medical wing, Louise's prison uniform was soaked with blood. The fluorescent lights overhead blurred into white streaks. Faces appeared above her, a nurse, young and frightened. Dr. Sarah Chen, the prison physician, her face tight with professional concern that couldn't quite hide the horror underneath. 34 weeks, Dr. Chen said sharply to someone Louise couldn't see. Get the neonatal kit. And find out why the hell it took half an hour to transport her. Louise felt hands on her belly, cold instruments, the brutal efficiency of an emergency delivery. She heard herself screaming Hope's name, begging God or anyone who was listening to let her daughter live. Just live. Please. The room went suddenly, terribly quiet. No cry. No first breath. Just silence and the steady beep of monitors and Dr. Chen's voice, soft and broken, time of death, for 17. They let Louise hold her? Hope was tiny, perfect, with Louise's nose and a dusting of dark hair. Her skin was already cooling. Louise pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead and felt something inside her chest shatter into pieces too small to ever repair. Hours later, or maybe minutes, time had stopped meaning anything. Dr. Chen came to her recovery bed. The doctor's hands were shaking as she pulled the curtain around them for privacy. Someone accessed your medical file, Dr. Chen whispered. Her eyes were red. Changed your blood type in the system. You're O negative. They gave you AB plasma during the hemorrhage. It caused a catastrophic reaction. She swallowed hard. I'm so sorry. This should never have happened. This couldn't have been an accident. Louise stared at her through the morphine haze, understanding crystallizing like ice in her veins. Who? She whispered. I don't know. The access log was wiped. But it was internal. Someone with administrative privileges. Dr. Chen glanced at the door, fear flickering across her face. I'm filing a report, but you need to understand, there are people here who don't follow the normal chain of command. Morrison, some of the other guards. They take orders from somewhere else. Somewhere else. Andrew. Louise closed her eyes and saw him in the courtroom, his hand on Victoria's knee, his lips forming those two words. You're erased. He hadn't just wanted her in prison. He'd wanted her destroyed. Every trace of their marriage eliminated. Every proof of their union murdered. The morphine pulled her under, but before she slipped away, Louise felt something cold and sharp replace the grief in her chest. Not vengeance, not yet. Something colder. More patient. Andrew Lemley had taken everything. Her freedom. Her reputation. Her child. He'd made one mistake. He'd left her alive. When she woke 12 hours later, the medical wing was dim and quiet. A different nurse was on duty, someone who wouldn't meet her eyes. Louise's body ached with the empty absence of hope, with the knowledge that her daughter had died because someone had deliberately, methodically murdered her. She thought of Morrison's smile. Mr. Lemley's got a lot of friends. Even in here. She thought of the 30-minute delay. The changed blood type. The wiped access logs. And she made a promise to the daughter she would never hold again, to the ghost Andrew thought he'd erased. She would survive this. She would document everything. She would find every thread of the conspiracy that had destroyed her life, and she would pull until Andrew Lemley's entire world unraveled. He wanted her erased. She would become his nightmare instead. They moved Louise out of segregated housing 3 weeks after Hope died. No explanation, just a bored guard telling her to pack her things, the Bible with its hidden pages, the prison-issued underwear, nothing else. They assigned her to general population, a cell with a woman named Rita who sold commissary cigarettes and asked no questions, which suited Louise fine. She was hollow. Functional. She ate because her body required fuel. She showered because the alternative drew attention. But inside, where hope had been, there was only a vast and calculating silence. The prison library became her sanctuary. It was small, underfunded, mostly romance novels and outdated legal texts, but it had tables and quiet and a sense of order that the rest of FCI Danbury lacked. Louise went every day during rec time, sat in the back corner, and read everything she could find about securities law, corporate fraud, and the appeals process. That's where she met Doc. Dr. Patricia Sterling was 60, rail-thin, with steel-grey hair cut short and sharp blue eyes that miss nothing. The other inmates called her Doc, some out of respect, some mockery. She'd been a psychiatrist before prison, or a professor, or a lawyer, depending on who told the story. She played chess alone at the library's single chess table, moving pieces for both sides with the focused intensity of someone solving an equation. "You're the one Morrison hates," Doc said without looking up, the third time Louise sat at a nearby table. "The woman who lost her baby." Louise's hands tightened on the book she wasn't reading. "I didn't lose her. She was murdered." "Yes." Doc moved a night, considering the board. "Morrison's been bragging about it in the guard break room. Calls it following orders. Do you play?" Louise looked at the chessboard, at Doc's calm expression, and understood she was being offered something. Not sympathy. Something more useful. "I used to," Louise said. She sat down. Doc set up the pieces. They played in silence for 20 minutes before Doc said, "Lemley Capital." Louise's hand froze over a pawn. "I investigated them in 2015, Doc continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Senior investigator, Sector Division of Enforcement. We had evidence of a sophisticated insider trading network. Andrew Lemley was getting advance information on federal policy changes, FDA approvals, EPA regulations, Fed interest rate decisions. He had sources in 3 different agencies." She moved her bishop. "I spent 18 months building the case. It was airtight. I was ready to file. What happened? I was arrested 48 hours before my scheduled testimony to the commission." Doc's smile was bitter. "Falsifying federal documents. Fabricating witness statements. Suddenly there was evidence, emails I'd never sent, reports I'd never written, witnesses who swore I'd coerced them. My own agency turned on me. 8 years in federal prison." She looked up, meeting Louise's eyes. "Andrew Lemley doesn't just win. He erases people who threaten him." Louise felt something shift in her chest, the hollow space filling with cold recognition. "The question is," Doc said softly, "what did you threaten him with?" Louise told her everything. Not the sanitized version she'd tried to tell her lawyer, her family, the judge who wouldn't listen. The truth. The algorithm she designed in 2017, the revolutionary pattern recognition framework that made Lemley Capital billions. The marriage Andrew denied. The pregnancy that made her a liability. The trial that erased her existence. Hope's murder in the medical wing. When she finished, Doc was quiet for a long moment, studying the chessboard. "You created the algorithm," Doc said finally. "Every line of code. Every innovation. It was mine. Can you prove it?" Louise thought of the pages hidden in her Bible. The names, the dates, the witnesses. "I'm building the evidence." But Andrew controls everything: the courts, the media, the records. Doc's eyes lit up with something Louise recognized: the sharp, hungry intelligence of someone who'd spent years in a cage thinking about revenge. "Not everything," Doc said. She leaned closer. "I still have contacts on the outside. People who owe me favors. People who know Andrew Lemley is dirty but couldn't touch him before." She moved her queen, capturing Louise's rook. "You have something I never had: proof of authorship. Intellectual property theft. That's not just fraud, it's your life's work. Your identity." He made it disappear. "The marriage license, the emails, everything. Digital footprints don't disappear, Louise. They just get buried." Doc smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression Louise had seen since Andrew Maldur erased in court. "And I know people who are very good at digging." Louise looked at the chessboard, at the pieces Doc had been methodically positioning while they talked. She was 3 moves from checkmate and hadn't even realized it. "Why are you helping me?" "Because Andrew Lemley destroyed my career and took 5 years of my life," Doc said simply. "And because you're not the first woman he's erased. You're just the first one who might have enough proof to bury him." She held out her hand. "So, do we have work to do?" Louise shook it. The hollow space in her chest filled with something cold and sharp and patient. "Yes," she said. "We have work to do." The contraband tablet arrived 3 months into Louise's education, smuggled in by a guard Doc had compromised with information about his own off-books income streams. It was an old Android, cracked screen, battery that died after 90 minutes, but it had encrypted messaging and a browser that could access the dark web through the prison's poorly secured Wi-Fi network. Doc taught Louise how to use it like a surgeon teaching someone to hold a scalpel. Every session was careful, deliberate, timed to avoid the guard rotations Morrison controlled. They worked in the library during the chaos of rec time, the tablet hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of the Federalist Papers. "Securities law is a weapon," Doc said, pulling up case files on the tiny screen. "But only if you understand how to wield it. Andrew didn't just steal your algorithm, he committed securities fraud the moment he took Lemley Capital public with technology he claimed to own." Louise absorbed everything. The elements of fraud: material misrepresentation, intent to deceive, reliance, damages. The statutes of limitations. The discovery process. How to preserve evidence in ways that couldn't be challenged in court. Doc had spent 30 years in enforcement. She knew every loophole, every precedent, every crack in the system where light could get through. But it was Doc's former colleagues, the ones who'd believed her, who'd known she was framed, who provided the real ammunition. Through encrypted channels, a woman named Sarah Park at the SEC sent files. Carefully redacted, technically unofficial, but devastating. Andrew Lemley's pattern didn't start with Louise. It went back 15 years. Jennifer Hartwell, 2005. Brilliant derivatives trader, white, 28 years old. She designed the risk assessment model that launched Lemley Capital's first major fund. 6 months after the launch, she demanded equity and credit. She died 3 weeks later when her brakes failed on the FDR drive. The investigation ruled it mechanical failure. Her family settled quietly with Andrew for an undisclosed sum. Maria Vasquez, 2011. Latina, MIT graduate, 32. She developed the high-frequency trading infrastructure that made Andrew's firm competitive with Goldman and Morgan Stanley. When she threatened to leave and take her code to a competitor, she was arrested for hacking into Lemley Capital servers she'd built. She took a plea deal, 2 years in minimum security and an NDA that forbade her from working in finance ever again. Dr. Patricia Sterling, 2015. Investigated Andrew's insider trading network. Framed for falsifying documents. 8 years in FCI Danbury. And now Louise Myers, 2019. The algorithm that made him a billionaire. Imprisoned. Her child murdered. He doesn't just steal, Louise whispered, staring at the names on the screen. He erases. Yes, Doc said. And he's been doing it for long enough that he thinks he's invincible. But then Louise found something else. Something Doc's contact had flagged with a simple note, "Thought you'd find this interesting." The blockchain timestamps. Louise had been experimenting with Ethereum in 2017, back when Andrew had dismissed cryptocurrency as nerd money and forbidden her from wasting company resources on it. So she'd used her personal account, her own node, timestamping her algorithm development on the blockchain as a way to track iterations. Every commit. Every major breakthrough. Every line of code. All permanently recorded on a decentralized ledger with her digital signature. Andrew didn't know. He'd stolen her laptop, her files, her cloud backups, but he hadn't known about the blockchain. The code still existed, immutable and provable, showing that Louise Myers had created the algorithm 18 months before Andrew claimed to have developed it. "This is it," Doc breathed. "This is proof of authorship he can't destroy." Louise stared at the screen, at the cryptographic proof of her genius, and felt something like hope for the first time since hope had died. Then Doc's contact sent one more file. "You need to see this," the message read. "Financial irregularities at Lemley Capital. Ongoing." The file detailed a pattern of unauthorized withdrawals, shell company transfers, and offshore accounts that didn't match Andrew's known financial behavior. Someone inside Lemley Capital had been siphoning money for at least 3 years. Small amounts at first, then larger. Millions. Tens of millions. The accounts traced back to a name Louise recognized immediately, Victoria Ashford. "She's embezzling from him," Louise said slowly. Doc leaned in, reading over her shoulder. "And look at the dates. She started 6 months after Andrew went public with your algorithm. She's been stealing from him the entire time she's been with him. Does he know?" Doc scrolled further, finding internal emails her contact had obtained. There, an exchange between Andrew and his head of security, dated 8 months ago. "We have confirmation. Victoria has been moving funds through the Cayman accounts. Approximately $47 million to date. Do not confront her yet. I need to secure the prenup revision first. Once she's locked in legally, we'll deal with it." Louise read it twice, understanding dawning. He knows she's robbing him. And he's keeping her close anyway. Until he can trap her the same way he trapped you, Doc said. Make her think she's safe, then destroy her when it's convenient. Louise thought of Victoria in the courtroom, smiling at her phone while Louise's life ended. Victoria had seemed so confident, so secure in her position. She had no idea she was dating a man who was already planning her erasure. "We could warn her," Louise said. "We could," Doc agreed. "Or we could wait and see if Andrew's pattern continues. See if he makes the same mistakes with her that he made with you." Louise looked at the evidence they'd built over 2 years, the pattern of erasure, the blockchain proof, the insider trading network, and now Victoria's embezzlement. Pieces of a puzzle that was finally taking shape. "How much longer until I have enough?" she asked. Doc smiled. "You already have enough to destroy him. Now we're just making sure he can never come back." Louise Myers had 1 year left on her sentence when she became a ghost. Not literally, though sometimes, watching Morrison walk past her cell without that familiar sneer, she wondered if she'd learned to make herself invisible. No. She'd become something more dangerous than invisible. She'd become a ghost in Andrew Lemley's machine. It started with Doc's lawyer on the outside. Martin Reeves, 68, retirement age but sharp as surgical steel, filed a wrongful termination lawsuit on Doc's behalf in March 2023. Not against the SEC, that would have been futile. Against Lemley Capital, for conspiracy to interfere with federal investigations. It was a civil suit, seemingly minor, the kind of thing that would settle quietly for nuisance money. Except Martin Reeves requested discovery. Specifically, he requested all internal communications from Lemley Capital between 2015 and 2020 related to federal regulatory inquiries, SEC investigations, and employee terminations. Andrew fought it. Of course he did. Attorney-client privilege, trade secrets, irrelevant time period, his lawyers filed every motion to block production. Which only made him look guilty. Which was exactly the point. While Andrew's legal team burned billable hours fighting document requests, Louise sat in the prison library with Doc and created her ghost. The account was anonymous, untraceable, routed through servers in Estonia and encrypted 6 ways from Sunday. Doc's contacts on the outside, former colleagues who'd never believed she was guilty, tech-savvy sons and daughters of inmates she'd helped over the years, built the infrastructure. Louise provided the information. She called it at Lemley Leaks. The first post went live on a Wednesday morning in April. Lemley Capital trades ahead of FDA drug approvals with suspicious accuracy. Between 2018 to 2022, firm profited $340 million on pharmaceutical stocks 24 to 48 hours before major regulatory announcements. Statistical probability, 0.003%. Either Andrew Lemley is the luckiest man alive, or he has sources inside federal agencies. No classified information. No stolen documents. Just publicly available trading data, arranged in a pattern that screamed insider trading to anyone who knew how to look. The kind of thing that individually meant nothing, but compiled and contextualized, told a story. Financial journalists loved it. By Friday, 3 major outlets had published think pieces. Lemley Capital's stock dropped 4%. The second post went live 2 weeks later. Victoria Ashford, COO of Lemley Capital, previously worked as executive assistant to Congressman Richard Walsh, Democrat, New York, chairman of House Financial Services Committee. Walsh's portfolio trades mirror Lemley Capital positions with 87% correlation rate. Walsh received $250,000 in campaign contributions from Lemley-linked PACs in 2020 alone. Again, all public information. Campaign finance records, stock disclosures, employment history, anyone could have found it. But no one had bothered to connect the dots until Louise, with 4 years of prison library time and a photographic memory for numbers, drew the lines between them. CNN picked up the story. Walsh denied everything. The SEC announced a preliminary inquiry. Lemley Capital stock dropped another 7%. Andrew couldn't find the source. Louise knew because Doc heard about it from the guards. Morrison and the others were frustrated that their golden goose was suddenly hemorrhaging value. They tried to trace at Lemley Leaks, hired private security firms, launched internal investigations. But the account posted irregularly, from different countries, always careful to stay just on the right side of legal. No hacking. No theft. Just a relentless drip of damaging but non-prosecutable information. The third post was more personal. Andrew Lemley filed for divorce from Louise Myers in October 2019, claiming 3-month marriage was an impulsive mistake. Divorce decree sealed. But Lemley Capital internal emails from 2017 to 2019, obtained via FOIA requests for federal investigation docs, reference Louise's algorithm 47 times. Why divorce the woman whose work made you billions? That one hit differently. Because it wasn't just about insider trading anymore. It was about theft. It was about a woman erased from her own creation. Investors grew nervous. If Lemley Capital's flagship algorithm wasn't Andrew's innovation, if it belonged to a convicted felon who might have legitimate intellectual property claims, then what exactly were they investing in? The stock dropped 15% in a single day. Louise sat in her cell that night, her Bible open to the pages where Hope's memory lived in careful ink, and imagined Andrew in his Tribeca penthouse, watching his empire crack. She wasn't there yet. Not close. But she could feel him starting to panic. Starting to wonder where the leaks were coming from. Starting to realize that you can't erase someone who's documented everything. Then she sent the email. Doc's tech contacts had helped her set up an encrypted account, one-time use, completely anonymous. She drafted the message in the library, revised it 7 times, showed it to Doc only once. "Are you sure?" Doc had asked. Louise thought of Hope. Of Morrison's smile. Of Andrew mouthing "You're erased" across the courtroom. "I'm sure." The email was simple. No threats. No dramatics. Just a single attachment, a screenshot of the algorithm's original code, timestamped April 2017, with Louise's digital signature embedded in the metadata. The kind of signature that couldn't be faked, couldn't be altered, that proved beyond any doubt who had written those lines. Subject line: "The ghost you tried to bury is coming home." She sent it to Andrew's personal email, the address he thought was private, that he'd used for their wedding planning, for love notes during late nights at the office. The address Louise had memorized because once, a lifetime ago, she'd been his wife. She sent it at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, timing it so he'd see it first thing in the morning. Before coffee. Before his armor was on. When he was still vulnerable. Then she waited. The next day, Lemley Capital's head of security resigned. No explanation, just a terse press release about pursuing other opportunities. 2 days after that, Andrew gave his first interview in months, CNBC, Damage Control, assuring investors that the company was strong, that the allegations were baseless, that he would fully cooperate with any investigation. He looked tired. The camera caught shadows under his eyes that expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. His smile, usually so perfectly crafted, faltered twice during the 7-minute segment. Doc watched it with Louise in the common room. When it ended, Doc said quietly, "He knows." "Yes," Louise said. "He knows you're alive. He knows you're coming." Louise thought of the year she still had left. 12 more months of fluorescent lights and body counts and Morrison's presence in the corridor. 12 more months to document. To plan. To make absolutely certain that when she walked out of FCI Danbury, she was ready. "Let him know," she said. "Let him spend the next year wondering what else I have. What other ghosts are waiting?" Doc smiled. It was the expression of a woman who'd lost everything and found, in the wreckage, something sharp enough to draw blood. "Your move," she said, gesturing to the chessboard between them. Louise looked at the pieces. She was 7 moves from checkmate. And unlike the first game they'd played, this time Doc was the one who hadn't seen it coming. "Checkmate," Louise said softly. And in her mind, she saw Andrew sitting in his penthouse, staring at a screenshot of code he'd stolen, trying to calculate how a woman he'd tried to erase had just reached through for years and touched him. Victoria Ashford was 29 years old when she realized Andrew Lemley was going to erase her too. She found the papers on a Thursday afternoon in late September, tucked in the back of his office safe behind the Patek Philippe he never wore and the emergency cash he kept for reasons he never explained. Divorce documents. A prenuptial agreement drafted by Sullivan and Cromwell, Andrew's most expensive lawyers. 73 pages of legal language that boil down to a simple message: after 3 years of marriage, Victoria would walk away with nothing. Not the Tribeca penthouse. Not the Southampton house. Not a single share of Lemley Capital stock. Just a quiet exit and an NDA so airtight she'd never be able to speak his name again without risking financial ruin. The date on the draft was August 15, 2023. 2 weeks after Lemley started hemorrhaging his reputation. 1 week after his head of security resigned. 3 days after someone sent him an encrypted email that made him drink an entire bottle of Macallan 25 and throw his laptop across the bedroom. Victoria sat in Andrew's leather chair, the one that cost more than most people's cars, and felt something cold and clarifying settle in her chest. Not hurt. She'd never loved him. Not surprise, she'd always known what Andrew was capable of. She'd helped him destroy Louise Myers, after all. She'd sat in that courtroom with her hand on his knee, playing the role of supportive partner while he lied under oath. No. What Victoria felt was rage at her own miscalculation. She'd thought she was a player. Turns out she'd just been another piece Andrew was willing to sacrifice. She photographed every page of the divorce documents with her phone, returned them exactly as she'd found them, and left Andrew's office with her Hermes bag and her perfect smile and a plan forming in the sharpest corners of her mind. By Monday morning, she'd contacted Louise Myers' legal team. The meeting took place in a conference room at Quinn Emanuel, the firm that had taken Louise's case pro bono after Lemley made her story impossible to ignore. Victoria wore Armani, navy, conservative, the uniform of someone to be taken seriously. Louise's lead attorney, Sarah Chen, watched her with the carefully neutral expression of a lawyer who'd seen every angle. "I have recordings," Victoria said without preamble. 2 years' worth. Andrew doesn't know about them. Sarah Chen's pen stopped moving. What kind of recordings? The kind where he admits to framing Louise. Bribing the prosecution. Paying guards at FCI Danbury. Victoria's voice was steady, clinical. The kind where he laughs about getting rid of the inconvenient black wife. His words. Not mine. The room went very quiet. There's also the matter of Hope Myers, Victoria continued. She'd practiced this part, knew she had to deliver it without emotion or they'd see her as a monster. Andrew paid Morrison, the guard, $25,000 to delay Louise's medical care. There are bank records. Encrypted messages. I have copies of everything. Sarah Chen's face had gone carefully blank. Why are you bringing this to us? Victoria smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Because Andrew's planning to divorce me and leave me with nothing. Because I'm not interested in going down with a sinking ship. And because I'm a better negotiator than he ever gave me credit for. She slid a folder across the table. My terms are simple. Full immunity from any charges related to Louise's case. Witness protection if necessary. And 20% of any intellectual property recovery when Louise reclaims ownership of her algorithm. 20%, Sarah said slowly. Lemley Capital's valuation is currently at $8.2 billion. 70% of that value is directly attributable to Louise's algorithm. You do the math. Victoria leaned forward. I'm offering you everything you need to destroy Andrew Lemley. I'm offering you his own words, his own admissions, evidence that even his expensive lawyers can't make disappear. In exchange, I walk away with what I'm owed for 3 years of playing his perfect wife while he committed federal crimes. You helped him frame an innocent woman. Yes, Victoria said. She didn't flinch. I did. And I'm offering to testify to that. To all of it. The manufactured evidence, the witness coaching, everything I know about how Andrew operates. She paused. I'm also offering you something else. Leverage. She pulled out her phone, pulled up a video file, and pressed play. Andrew's voice filled the conference room. Drunk, bitter, talking to someone off camera, Victoria had been in the bathroom, her phone recording on the nightstand. Louise actually believed I'd let her keep creating while pregnant. Like I was going to share credit with some, he used a slur that made Sarah Chen's jaw tighten. She built something brilliant and then got sentimental about it. Amateurs get attached. Professionals know when to eliminate liabilities. Victoria stopped the recording. I have 17 more like that. Hours of Andrew being exactly who he is when he thinks no one's listening. Sarah Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I need to consult with my client. Of course. Victoria stood, smoothed her skirt. But tell Louise something for me. Tell her I know I'm not the hero in this story. I'm the woman who helped destroy her life because it benefited me. But I'm also the woman who's going to hand her the knife to cut out Andrew's heart. She picked up her bag. I'm just smart enough to make sure I get paid for it. She left the Quinn Emanuel offices and walked out into Manhattan sunshine, feeling lighter than she had in years. Andrew thought he was the only one who knew how to erase people. He'd forgotten that the women he erased learned to be ghosts. And ghosts, Victoria had discovered, made excellent assassins. 3 days later, Louise Meyer's legal team filed a motion to overturn her conviction based on newly discovered evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. Attached to the motion were 17 audio recordings, 1,200 pages of documents, and the testimony of Victoria Ashford, who was willing to admit everything. The ghost had just become an army. Louise Myers walked out of FCI Danbury on February 14, 2024, into air so cold it hurt to breathe. For years, 2 months, and 17 days after she'd entered in shackles, 7 months pregnant with a daughter who would never take her first breath. She wore the same navy dress, laundered, pressed by the prison staff as a bizarre courtesy, and carried a single cardboard box containing a Bible with hidden pages and a photograph of hope that didn't exist anywhere but in her memory. Doc walked out beside her. Patricia Sterling, 64 now, thinner than when they'd met but with eyes that still missed nothing. Her conviction had been vacated 3 weeks earlier, the evidence Louise's team uncovered proving what Doc had said all along. She'd been framed to silence and SEC investigation that threatened Andrew Lemley's empire. Strange, isn't it? Doc said, squinting at the winter sun. Freedom. Louise couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around something too large for words, grief and rage and a fierce, cold satisfaction all tangled together. She just nodded. Waiting in the parking lot was a man in an impeccable charcoal suit. Marcus Chen, Harvard law professor, architect of 3 landmark intellectual property cases, and the attorney who'd read about Louise's story in the New York Times and called her pro bono lawyers to offer his services. Ms. Myers, he said, extending his hand. Let's go destroy him. 48 hours later, they filed the motion. The legal documents were surgical. 163 pages detailing every lie Andrew Lemley had told under oath, every piece of evidence he'd manufactured, every bribe he'd paid. Victoria's testimony. The blockchain records. The audio recordings where Andrew's voice, drunk, arrogant, certain of his own invincibility, admitted to everything. Louise actually believed I'd let her keep creating while pregnant. Professionals know when to eliminate liabilities. Morrison handled it. Cost me 25 grand but worth every penny. Within 72 hours, federal judge Patricia Hendricks, the same judge who'd sentenced Louise, issued an emergency order vacating Louise's conviction. The courtroom was packed with journalists. Judge Hendricks read her decision in a voice that shook with barely controlled fury. This court has reviewed evidence of prosecutorial misconduct so egregious, so calculated, that it strikes at the very heart of our justice system. Ms. Myers was not merely wrongly convicted. She was systematically destroyed by a conspiracy that involved corporate fraud, witness tampering, and acts that can only be described as murder. Louise sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, and felt nothing. She'd imagined this moment for 4 years. She'd thought she'd cry, or scream, or feel some rush of vindication. Instead, there was just a vast, cold silence where her anger had lived. The real satisfaction came 1 week later. The SEC reopened its investigation into Lemley Capital. The blockchain evidence, immutable, timestamped, irrefutable, showed Andrew had stolen Louise's algorithm and built a $9 billion empire on intellectual property that had never been his. Former employees, emboldened by Victoria's testimony and Louise's exoneration, came forward with their own stories. The assistant who'd been harassed into silence. The analyst who'd discovered irregularities and been paid to disappear. The compliance officer who tried to report insider trading and found herself suddenly unemployed. Federal prosecutors moved fast. They froze Andrew's assets, all of them. The Tribeca penthouse, the Southampton estate, the art collection, the offshore accounts he thought were hidden. Major clients withdrew billions overnight. Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, the sovereign wealth fund from Singapore, they pulled their money and their names, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. The board of Lemley Capital demanded Andrew's resignation. He refused. They voted him out anyway, 14-1. Only his cousin voted to keep him. The markets were vicious. Lemley Capital stock went into free fall. 92% loss in 8 trading days. Billions of dollars evaporating like smoke. And through it all, Louise documented everything. She sat in Marcus Chen's office with her laptop and her photographic memory and built the case for intellectual property recovery. Every line of code she'd written. Every innovation that had made the algorithm revolutionary. Every email, every timestamp, every proof that the work Andrew claimed as his own had been created by a black woman he'd tried to erase. The arraignment was scheduled for March 1st. Same courthouse. Same courtroom. Same mahogany panels and fluorescent lights where Louise had heard the word guilty and felt her world end. But this time, she sat in the gallery with Doc beside her and Marcus Chen on her other side, and watched Andrew Lemley be led in wearing an orange jumpsuit that made his expensive town look sallow. The charges took 11 minutes to read. 47 counts. Corporate fraud. Witness tampering. Bribery of federal officials. Conspiracy to obstruct justice. Intellectual property theft. And the charge that made Louise's hands tighten until her knuckles disappeared, voluntary manslaughter in the death of Hope Myers. Andrew's lawyers argued for bail. Federal prosecutors argued he was a flight risk with resources in 17 countries. Judge Hendricks listened to both sides with an expression carved from stone. Bail denied, she said. Remand the defendant to federal custody. Andrew turned then, scanning the gallery, and his eyes found Louise. For one terrible, crystallizing moment, they looked at each other across the courtroom. The same space where he'd cried false tears and mouthed you erased for years ago. Louise didn't smile. Didn't gloat. She just held his gaze and let him see what she'd become in the years he'd tried to bury her. A ghost. A witness. A woman who documented everything. As the marshals led Andrew away, Louise felt Doc's hand cover hers. "Your daughter would be proud," Doc said quietly. Louise closed her eyes and saw Hope's face, imagined, never known, forever loved. "I know," she said. And for the first time in 4 years, she let herself breathe. Louise Myers stood in her corner office on the 42nd floor of a building overlooking Central Park and watched November rain streak the windows into abstract art. 5 years since the conviction. 9 months since her exoneration. 6 months since Myers Financial Technologies launched with $40 million in venture capital and a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 companies who'd quietly abandoned Lemley Capital when the walls came down. Her algorithm, legally, irrevocably hers now after 8 months of litigation, had been refined, improved, made even more revolutionary than the version Andrew had stolen. Forbes called her the Phoenix of Finance. Bloomberg ran a cover story, How Louise Myers Rose from Prison to Power. The New York Times profiled her resilience, her brilliance, the way she turned erasure into empire. She testified before Congress twice. Once about prosecutorial misconduct. Once about the systematic theft of intellectual property from women and minorities in tech and finance. Both times, the gallery had been standing room only. Myers Financial Technologies was currently valued at $800 million. By next quarter, projections showed $1 billion. Louise wore Tom Ford now. Custom suits in colors that made her skin glow. Her natural hair in elegant twists. Diamond studs that cost more than the Armani dress she'd worn to her sentencing. She looked, objectively, like success incarnated. Inside, where Hope's ghost lived, she felt nothing but the cold, patient satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. Her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Miss Myers? There's a situation. Andrew Lemley is in the lobby. He's requesting a meeting." Louise's hand stilled on her coffee cup. She'd known this would come eventually. Andrew had been out on bail for 6 months, his trial delayed by motions and counter-motions while his expensive lawyers burned through what little money he had left unfrozen. "Send him up," she said. Curiosity, she told herself. That's all this was. The desire to see what a man looked like when everything he'd built on stolen foundations finally collapsed. Andrew entered her office 7 minutes later, and Louise felt a shock of recognition at how thoroughly he'd been destroyed. He'd aged a decade in 9 months. Grey at the temples turned to grey throughout. The expensive tan faded to prison pallor despite the bail. His suit, still expensive, still tailored, hung on a frame that had lost 20 pounds. He looked like a haunting of himself. Louise. He tried to smile. His hand shook. "You look incredible. This office, the company, everything you've built, I'm so glad you've been able to. Look, I know I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But I want to make this right." Louise said nothing. Just watched him with the same analytical attention she'd once given to market patterns. "If you could speak to the prosecutors," Andrew continued, the words tumbling faster now, desperate. "Explain that some of this was a misunderstanding. That emotions ran high, that the marriage was complicated, that I never meant for Hope." His voice cracked. "Please. Louise. I know I hurt you. But 20 years? I'll die in prison. You've won. You've built something amazing. Can't that be enough?" Louise let him talk for 3 full minutes. Let him exhaust his prepared speech, his carefully crafted appeals to her mercy, her success, her supposed satisfaction. Then she interrupted, her voice calm as winter. "Do you remember what you mouthed to me in court?" "You're erased." Andrew's face went carefully blank. "You didn't just try to erase my work, Andrew. You tried to erase my existence. My marriage. My child." Louise stood, walked to the window, looked out at the park where people lived whole lives Andrew would never touch. "You paid a guard to let my daughter die. You framed me for stealing my own creation. You sat in that courtroom and lied under oath while I was 7 months pregnant with your baby. I gave you everything." Andrew's voice rose, the mask slipping. "You were nobody. A smart analyst, yes, but nobody. I gave you access, opportunity, a platform for your ideas. You stole for years of my life." Louise turned, and her expression was serene, almost peaceful. The peace of someone who'd already won and was just watching the enemy realize it. "You murdered my daughter. And now you want forgiveness." Andrew's face crumpled. Real tears now, or the best performance of his life, it didn't matter anymore. "Please. Louise, please. I'll lose everything. 20 years in federal prison. I'll die there. I'm 57 years old. Please." Louise picked up her phone. "Security? Mr. Lemley is ready to leave." "You bitch." Andrew lunged forward, stopped by the desk between them. "I made you. Everything you have, you built on work we created together. Goodbye, Andrew." Security arrived, 2 men in dark suits who'd been briefed on exactly who Andrew Lemley was and what he'd done. They took his arms with professional gentleness that was somehow worse than force. "This isn't over," Andrew shouted as they led him toward the elevator. "You think you've won, but I still have. I'll appeal. Louise, please, just listen." The elevator doors closed on his pleading. Louise's assistant appeared in the doorway, concern creasing her young face. "Ms. Myers? Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Louise checked her watch. "I have the Senate subcommittee meeting in 30 minutes. Is the car ready?" "Waiting downstairs." And Mr. Chen called. He confirmed dinner at 8. Marcus. Who made her laugh? Who knew everything she'd survived and saw her completely? Who'd held her hand in court when Andrew was arraigned and whispered, "You're remarkable," like he meant it? Louise gathered her files, her tablet, her notes for congressional testimony about legislation protecting intellectual property rights for women and minorities in tech. Behind her, through the window, she could see Andrew being ushered into a car by his lawyers. He looked small from 42 floors up. She felt nothing. No satisfaction. No rage. Just the cold certainty that she'd survived and he hadn't. 3 hours later, Louise stood before Congress. The chamber was packed, journalists, advocates, other women who'd been erased and were learning to haunt. Behind her, on massive screens, Andrew Lemley's mugshot. The visual was deliberate. A reminder of what happened to men who thought they could steal women's work and get away with it. She spoke for 47 minutes. Her voice never wavered. Afterward, leaving the Capitol building into November cold, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Louise almost deleted it. She got threats weekly from Andrew's supporters, from men who saw her success as a personal attack. But something made her open it. Impressive testimony, Ms. Myers. We should talk. There are others like you. Others he erased. Attached was a photograph. A woman, maybe 60, with silver hair and sharp eyes. Louise recognized her from the research Doc had done years ago, Sarah Vance, Andrew's first business partner in 1995. the woman who'd supposedly died in a car accident after questioning Andrew's accounting practices. The photo's metadata showed it was taken yesterday. In Prague. She was alive. Louise stood on the Capitol steps, November wind cutting through her Tom Ford coat, and smiled. Perhaps Andrew's reckoning wasn't finished after all. Perhaps there were more ghosts waiting to come home. The end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.